The ambulance bill came to $14,000 before I'd even left the hospital parking lot. And I remember thinking, sitting in that wheelchair with my daughter pushing me toward Douglas's waiting car, that if I hadn't sat across from an insurance agent named Fred Kowalski in my own kitchen 22 years earlier, everything that happened over the following 6 months would have gone very differently. Not the stroke itself. That was never something a piece of paper could prevent. But everything after it. The house. The arguments. The way my children looked at each other across my hospital bed like two people doing arithmetic they didn't want me to see them doing. That was a different matter entirely. My name is Harold Chessman. I'm 74 years old, and for 31 years, I taught shop class at Kellerman High School outside Rockford, Illinois. The kind of class most schools don't bother offering anymore, where boys and girls learn to run a table saw safely and respect what a ruder bit could do to a careless finger. My wife Doris passed 9 years ago. Cancer, the slow kind that gives you time to say everything you need to say, which I've come to understand is its own kind of mercy, even though it didn't feel like one at the time. I want to take you back to a Tuesday evening in March, the kind of ordinary weeknight nobody remembers until it becomes the hinge everything else swings on. I was refinishing a rocking chair in the garage, the same chair Doris used to sit in on the porch every June evening, when I felt something go strange behind my left eye, a pressure I'd never felt before. And then my left hand simply stopped listening to me. I remember thinking, with a strange clarity that I've since learned is common in these situations, that I needed to sit down before I fell down, and that's the last clear memory I have of that evening. My neighbor found me 20 minutes later when he noticed the garage light still on well past dark, and the table saw idling with nobody standing at it. I want to ask you something before I go further, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. Have you ever made a quiet financial decision years before you needed it? One that everyone around you thought was unnecessary at the time, and then watch that decision become the only thing standing between your family and disaster? I spent 11 days in the hospital, and then 4 weeks in a rehabilitation facility, relearning how to use my left hand well enough to hold a chisel again, which, I'll tell you honestly, felt like the most important goal of my entire recovery. More important even than walking without the cane I still use today. The stroke had been what the doctors called moderate, not catastrophic. But moderate is a word that means very little when you're the one lying in that bed listening to your own children discuss your future like you're a property they've inherited early. My son Douglas is a financial planner. Ironically enough, works downtown for one of the big firms. Wears good suits, understands compound interest better than almost anyone I've ever met. My daughter Renee is a nurse, has been for 18 years, mostly in cardiac care, which meant she'd watched more families go through exactly what mine was about to go through than either of us fully understood at the time. Both of them love me. I want that said plainly before anything else, because what happened over the following months wasn't a story about children who didn't care. It was a story about children who cared enormously and were terrified in two very different directions. The rehabilitation facility social worker, a patient, tired-looking woman named Ms. Alvarez, sat down with all three of us on my 9th day there and explained, in the careful voice people use when they've delivered this particular news many times before, that continued skilled nursing care after discharge, given my level of need, would run somewhere between $9,000 and $11,000 a month, and that Medicare would cover a portion of it for a limited window and then stop covering it entirely, the way Medicare generally does with long-term custodial care, which surprises almost everyone the first time they learn it, usually at the worst possible moment to be learning it. Renee did the math out loud right there in that meeting the way nurses do, quickly and without flinching. $11,000 a month is $132,000 a year, Dad, even before we know how long you'll need it. Douglas, to his credit, didn't panic the way Renee did. He went quiet instead. The particular quiet of a man running numbers in his head that he already suspected he wasn't going to like. That evening, sitting beside my hospital bed, he said the sentence that started everything that followed. "Dad, I think we need to talk seriously about selling the house. I want you to understand what that house meant, because I don't think you can understand the rest of this story without it." Doris and I bought that house the year Douglas was born, on Larkspur Street. A modest 3-bedroom with a garage I'd converted into a proper shop over the decades. Every tool arranged exactly where my hands knew to find them without looking. Doris planted the rose bed along the east fence the summer before she got sick, and I still tended every spring, badly, but faithfully. Selling that house wasn't simply a financial transaction to me. It was closing a door I wasn't remotely ready to close. Here's the part neither of my children knew yet, sitting in that hospital room doing their separate calculations. 22 years earlier, back when I was 52, a friend of mine from the Union Hall named Pete Aldrich had gone through almost exactly this situation with his own father. A long hospital stay, followed by a nursing home bill that ate through his father's entire retirement savings in under 3 years. Then his house, then very nearly Pete's own savings when the state came looking for reimbursement through what's called Medicaid estate recovery. I'd known Pete for the better part of a decade by then, both of us teaching at Kellerman, him running the auto shop program 2 doors down from my wood shop, and I watched that whole situation unfold with him over dinners and Friday afternoon coffee in the teacher's lounge. Watched a proud, capable man slowly turn gray, watching his father's life savings disappear into a facility that, by Pete's own account, wasn't even particularly good. Pete's father had been exactly the kind of man who believed insurance salesmen were mostly con artists in decent suits, and Pete told me once, not long after the funeral, that he sometimes lay awake wondering whether a different decision 15 years earlier could have spared his father those final humiliating years of watching everything he built get signed away a little at a time. That conversation scared me in a way few things ever had, and it sent me, one ordinary Tuesday evening, to sit down at my own kitchen table with an insurance agent named Fred Kowalski. I want to explain what Fred and I actually discussed that evening because I think it matters, and because nobody had ever explained it to me plainly before that night either. A long-term care insurance policy, in the simplest terms, is coverage specifically for the kind of custodial and nursing care Medicare generally won't pay for long-term. The exact gap Miss Alvarez had just described to my children 22 years later. Fred walked me through the mechanics, a daily benefit amount, the maximum the policy would pay per day of covered care, an elimination period, essentially a deductible measured in days rather than dollars, meaning I'd cover the first 90 days myself before the policy started paying, and an inflation rider, which I nearly skipped to save money until Fred said something that stuck with me for 2 decades. He said, "Harold, nursing home costs today aren't nursing home costs in 20 years. Buy the rider, or you're insuring against a number that won't exist anymore by the time you need it." I bought the policy that evening for a premium that felt, at 52 years old, uncomfortably real, about $1,800 a year. Doris thought I was being morbid. My own brother laughed at me at a family barbecue that summer, said I was paying for a disaster that would probably never come, that I'd be better off just investing that money instead. I remember not having a particularly good answer for him at the time, beyond a feeling in my gut that I couldn't fully articulate. The same feeling, I suppose, that made me double-check a table saw guard, even on days when nothing seemed wrong with it. I want to ask you honestly, because I think it's worth sitting with. If a friend or a brother had laughed at a decision you made to protect a future you couldn't yet see clearly, would you have kept paying for it anyway, year after year, without any proof it would ever matter? I kept paying it anyway, $1,800 a year became roughly $2,200 by the time I was 60. Then a bit more after that as the insurer's rates adjusted, though nowhere near what a new policy would have cost someone starting from scratch at my age by that point. I want to be honest about something else too. There were at least 3 separate years, tight ones, right after Doris's diagnosis when medical bills were stacking up in a different direction entirely, when I seriously considered letting that policy lapse. I kept it anyway, mostly out of stubbornness by that point more than conviction. The same stubbornness that had gotten me through 31 years of teaching teenagers not to lose fingers to power tools. Sitting in that hospital bed, listening to Douglas explain why selling Larkspur Street might be necessary, I let him finish completely before I said anything at all. I want you to know that I did that on purpose because I wanted to understand fully what he and Renee were actually afraid of before I told them what I knew that they didn't. When Douglas finished, I asked him a single question. Before we talk about the house, can you find the number for a man named Fred Kowalski? He retired a long time ago, but his son took over the agency. It's called Prairie Assurance over on State Street. Douglas looked at me the way you look at someone who said something that doesn't fit the conversation you thought you were having. Dad, what does an insurance agency have to do with any of this? I told him. I told both of them, plainly, about that Tuesday evening 22 years earlier, about Pete Aldrich's father, about the $1,800 a year that had eventually grown into something considerably larger, about a daily benefit amount that, with the inflation rider Fred had insisted on, now sat comfortably above what Ms. Alvarez had quoted for my monthly care. I told them I'd never mentioned it over the years, not out of secrecy exactly, but because talking about the possibility of ending up exactly where I now was hadn't felt like dinner conversation for 2 decades running. Renee sat down slowly in the chair beside my bed. You've had this the whole time, since I was in college. Since before you started college, I said. Douglas, financial planner that he is, asked the question I'd been expecting from him specifically. What's the elimination period? And did you keep the inflation protection current? I told him 90 days, self-funded, which we could manage between Medicare's initial coverage and some savings. And yes, the inflation rider had compounded every single year since I signed it, which was the entire reason Fred had insisted on it in the first place. A decision my own brother had mocked at a barbecue a lifetime ago. I want to tell you honestly what that moment felt like, because I think it matters more than the numbers themselves. It wasn't triumph exactly. I didn't feel like I'd won an argument. What I felt, watching my daughter's shoulders drop about 2 inches with relief and my son's mind visibly shift from crisis management into simple logistics, was something closer to the feeling you get finishing a piece of furniture you started years earlier and nearly abandoned twice. A kind of quiet, exhausted satisfaction that the thing had finally found its purpose. Here's what I need you to understand about why this mattered so specifically, beyond simply having enough money. Because of my stroke and the mild cardiac irregularity the doctors discovered while treating it, I would not have qualified for a new long-term care policy at 74, even if I'd walked into Prairie Assurance with my checkbook open that same week. These policies require medical underwriting. Once you have a stroke on your record, once your heart shows irregularities, most insurers simply won't write you a new policy at any price, or they'll write one so restricted it barely covers anything at all. The $1,800 I paid Fred Kowalski at 52 wasn't just insurance against a future cost. It was insurance against a future version of myself, who would no longer be insurable, a version of myself, as it turned out, that I eventually became. If I hadn't sat down at that kitchen table 22 years earlier, none of what happened after that hospital room conversation would have gone the way it did. Larkspur Street would very likely be sold by now, or well on its way to it. Doris's rosebed would belong to whoever bought the place. And I suspect, though I can't know this for certain, that Douglas and Renee would have spent the following several years in the particular slow grinding resentment that develops between siblings, forced to make difficult financial decisions about a parent together. The kind of resentment that outlasts the crisis that created it by a good many years. None of that happened because a friend named Pete Aldrich's misfortune scared me enough, 22 years earlier, to sit through an uncomfortable conversation about a future I didn't want to imagine. And because I kept paying for that decision through years, when it felt, by every reasonable measure, like wasted money, the following months weren't without their difficulty, and I don't want to pretend they were. My recovery was slow and occasionally humiliating. Relearning to grip a pencil with a hand that used to guide a chisel through hardwood without a second thought. Renee moved back to Rockford for 4 months to help coordinate my care, which put real strain on her own marriage that took a while to fully repair afterward. Douglas, true to his profession, spent an entire weekend going through the policy documents line by line with Fred's son at the agency, making certain we understood every provision before we needed it, which I confess irritated me at the time, even though I understood exactly why he was doing it. My grandson Miles, Renee's boy, 11 years old that spring, came to visit me at the rehabilitation facility one Saturday and asked, with the particular bluntness only children manage, why Grandpa had to stay in the boring place instead of just going home. I told him the boring place was helping my hand remember how to work again. He considered that seriously for a moment and then asked whether the rocking chair in the garage was almost finished, because he wanted to sit in it when I was done. I finished that chair 4 months later, in October, sitting in the garage on Larkspur Street, in the house that was still mine, still ours, still exactly where Doris's roses were coming back for another season along the east fence. Pete Aldrich came by that same October, retired now for a decade, walking a little slower than he used to but still sharp as ever. He sat in the finished rocking chair before I did, tested it the way he tested everything, methodically, and told me it was good work. Better than the version I'd been fussing over before the stroke, he said, which I chose to take as a compliment about my recovery, rather than a comment on my earlier craftsmanship. I told him about Fred Kowalski, about the policy, about how his own father's story, all those years ago, had been the thing that finally pushed me across my own kitchen table to sign it. Pete went quiet for a long moment, rocking gently, looking out at the garden. Then he said his father would have liked knowing that some good had eventually come out of watching him lose everything, even if it came out sideways. 20 years later, in a friend's garage he'd never even lived to see. I've thought a great deal, in the 2 years since, about what I actually want people to take from this. Not simply that insurance matters, though it does, and not simply that you should buy long-term care coverage while you're still young enough and healthy enough to qualify for it. Though I genuinely encourage anyone listening who's anywhere near my age at 52 to at least sit down with someone and understand what your own gap looks like. What I keep returning to is something simpler than the financial mechanics. The version of yourself who makes a quiet, unglamorous decision at 52, one that nobody around you understands or appreciates, is trying to protect a version of yourself at 74 that you can't fully picture yet. Most years, that decision will look to everyone watching like wasted money and unnecessary worry. And then some ordinary Tuesday evening in a garage, it turns out to be the only thing standing between your family and a very different kind of story entirely. If you've ever made a decision like that, one that felt unnecessary for years until it very suddenly wasn't, I'd like to know. And if you haven't yet, and you're anywhere near the age I was when I sat down with Fred Kowalski, I'd ask you honestly, sitting where I sat that Tuesday evening in March, what would you